The most painful words are often spoken in rooms filled with people who choose to pretend they never heard them. My name is Lauren Mitchell, and the night everything changed began like dozens of family gatherings before it. It was a cool Saturday evening in early October, and I had spent most of the day helping prepare dinner at my mother-in-law's house. The smell of roasted turkey, baked vegetables, and fresh bread filled the kitchen while relatives arrived carrying desserts and bottles of sparkling cider. Children laughed in the backyard. Music played softly through a speaker in the living room. From the outside, it looked like the kind of family gathering people remember fondly for years. I wanted it to be that kind of night. After 15 years of marriage to David, I still found myself trying to fit into a family that never fully seemed to accept me. I told myself things had improved over the years. I told myself Margaret simply had a difficult personality. I told myself patience would eventually earn respect. Those were the stories I repeated whenever something hurt. That evening, I moved between the kitchen and dining room, making sure everyone had what they needed. I refilled drinks, carried serving dishes, and helped organize seating arrangements. Several relatives thanked me. A few even joked that I worked harder than anyone else at family events. I smiled and brushed off the compliments. Across the room, David sat talking with his cousins. Every now and then he glanced toward me and smiled. Everything seemed normal. Dinner began just after 6 o'clock. The long dining table was crowded with family members sharing stories and laughing. For a while, I relaxed. Then one of David's cousins mentioned how much effort I always put into family gatherings. Another relative nodded and said I had become an important part of keeping traditions alive. The comment was meant kindly. I remember smiling as I reached for my glass. Then Margaret laughed softly and shook her head. At first, I thought she was joking. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Lauren helps, but let us not forget she is not really family." The room went silent. Not gradually. Instantly. Forks stopped moving. Conversations disappeared. The air itself seemed to freeze. For a second, I genuinely thought someone would say something. Anyone. I looked around the table. Faces shifted awkwardly. Some people stared at their plates. Others looked away. Nobody challenged her. Nobody told her she was wrong. I felt heat rising in my chest, but I remained calm. Then I looked at David. More than anyone else, I expected something from him. A word. A reaction. A simple statement that I belonged. Instead, he lowered his eyes toward the table and said nothing. That silence hurt far more than Margaret's comment ever could. The conversation eventually resumed as if nothing unusual had happened, but I barely heard it. Throughout the rest of dinner, one thought repeated itself in my mind. After 15 years of showing up, helping, supporting, and loving these people, if they still did not see me as family, maybe I had spent far too long trying to earn a place that was never truly mine. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. David kept his eyes on the road while the headlights stretched across the dark highway ahead of us. The radio remained off. Normally, after family gatherings, we would talk about funny moments, upcoming plans, or people we had not seen in a while. This time, silence occupied every inch of the car. I waited for David to say something about what had happened at dinner. I waited for him to explain why he had stayed quiet. I waited for him to tell me his mother was wrong. The words never came. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. "Mom did not mean it the way it sounded," he said quietly. I stared out the windshield. Of all the things he could have said, that was the one he chose. "How was it supposed to sound?" I asked. David sighed heavily. "You know how she is." I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I had heard that excuse for years. Whenever Margaret said something hurtful, someone explained that she did not mean it. Whenever she crossed a line, people blamed her age, her personality, or her generation. Somehow everyone found a reason except the obvious one. Nobody expected her to change because everyone else was expected to adjust around her. Inside the house, I changed into comfortable clothes and began cleaning up a few things before bed. David followed me into the kitchen. He looked uncomfortable. "You are taking this too personally," he said. That sentence settled heavily between us. "Too personally?" I repeated. "She said I am not family." David rubbed the back of his neck. She was probably joking. For the first time that evening, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. I thought about the countless holidays I had helped organize. The birthdays I never missed. The hospital visits. The graduations. The family emergencies. The meals. the gifts, the support. 15 years of showing up whenever someone needed help. Yet the moment Margaret openly dismissed my place in the family, nobody objected. Not even my husband. That realization followed me into bed later that night. Long after David fell asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the evening in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more another uncomfortable truth emerged. Margaret's comment had not shocked me because it was new. It shocked me because she finally said out loud what I had quietly felt for years. There had always been a subtle line separating me from everyone else. I simply spent a long time pretending it was not there. The next morning, I woke up with the strange feeling that something important had ended. Nothing looked different. The house was the same. My marriage was the same. My responsibilities were the same. Yet the way I saw everything had changed. For years, I believed acceptance was something I could eventually earn. Sitting alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, I began wondering if I had been chasing something that was never actually being offered. Over the next several days, I found myself thinking about Margaret's comment far more than I wanted to admit. At first, I tried to dismiss it the same way I had dismissed so many uncomfortable moments before. I told myself it was one sentence spoken during an awkward dinner. I told myself I was overreacting. Yet the harder I tried to move on, the more impossible it became to ignore the question that kept returning to my mind. What if she was simply saying out loud what everyone else already believed? That possibility followed me through every part of my routine. At work, I caught myself replaying old family gatherings. During grocery trips, I remembered conversations I had forgotten years ago. Little memories surfaced unexpectedly. Times when family decisions were made without including me. Times when plans changed and nobody thought to tell me. Times when I was expected to help, but never truly invited to participate. None of those moments seemed significant on their own. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer avoid. One afternoon, while organizing old photographs in the living room, I came across an album from a family vacation taken nearly 8 years earlier. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something strange. In photograph after photograph, I was the person behind the camera. Everyone else appeared together, smiling, posing, sharing memories. My presence existed mostly through the fact that I had taken the pictures. The realization hit harder than I expected. It was such a small thing, yet somehow it captured exactly how I had felt for years. Present but separate. Included but not entirely. That evening, David came home from work and found me sitting quietly at the dining room table. He immediately sensed something was wrong. "You have been distant all week," he said. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Do you think I am family?" The question surprised him. "Of course you are." His answer came quickly, almost automatically. Normally, those words would have comforted me. This time, they did not. "Then why did nobody say anything?" I asked. David looked away. "I do not know." The honesty of that answer was more revealing than anything else he could have said. For years, I had assumed the problem was Margaret alone. Now I was beginning to understand something much more painful. A family is defined not only by the people who hurt you. It is also defined by the people who watch it happen and choose silence. Later, that night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I sat alone with a cup of tea and allowed myself to consider a possibility I had never seriously entertained before. Maybe the issue was not whether I belonged. Maybe the issue was that I had spent 15 years asking other people to decide my value. And for the first time, I began wondering what would happen if I stopped asking altogether. As the weeks passed, I stopped focusing on Margaret's words and started focusing on my own memories. The more honestly I examined the past, the more uncomfortable the pattern became. It was not one comment. It was not one dinner. It was years of small moments that I had explained away because I wanted peace more than I wanted clarity. One Saturday morning, while cleaning a hallway closet, I found several old holiday cards and family invitations tucked inside a storage box. Looking through them brought back memories I had not thought about in years. I remembered Christmas gatherings where I spent hours helping prepare meals while decisions about family traditions happened in other rooms. I remembered birthdays where I organized decorations, but somehow ended up sitting at the edge of conversations. I remembered vacations where everyone discussed plans together except me. At the time, I convinced myself none of it mattered. Now I was not so sure. The hardest realization was not that Margaret had always kept me at a distance. The hardest realization was recognizing how much energy I had invested trying to change her opinion. For 15 years, I believed that if I worked harder, helped more, stayed patient, and avoided conflict, acceptance would eventually come. Looking back, I could not remember a single moment when Margaret treated me like a daughter instead of an outsider who happened to marry her son. One evening, I attended a charity event with a close friend named Rebecca. We had known each other for nearly 10 years, and she was one of the few people who always spoke honestly. As we sat together after the event, she asked how I was doing. Normally, I would have said everything was fine. This time, I told her the truth. I described the dinner. Margaret's comment. David's silence. Rebecca listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me and asked a question I was not prepared for. Lauren, when was the last time you felt appreciated by that family? I opened my mouth to answer and then stopped. Several seconds passed. Then more. To my surprise, I could not think of a single example. Not one. That answer stayed with me during the drive home. Later that night, I stood in the kitchen looking out the window at the quiet neighborhood beyond our backyard. For years, I had measured my value through other people's approval. I wanted Margaret to see me as family. I wanted relatives to include me naturally. I wanted David to defend me without hesitation. Yet none of those things were under my control. The only thing I could control was how much of myself I continued giving to people who never seemed willing to give the same respect in return. For the first time, I stopped asking what I could do differently. Instead, I began asking a much more important question. What would my life look like if I stopped trying to earn a place at a table where I had never truly been welcomed in the first place? The question followed me for days. What would happen if I stopped trying to earn acceptance from people who had never truly offered it? At first, the idea felt uncomfortable. For so long, my role in the family had been built around helping, accommodating, and proving myself. I organized gatherings, remembered birthdays, bought thoughtful gifts, volunteered whenever someone needed assistance. Without realizing it, I had spent years treating acceptance like a reward that might eventually arrive if I worked hard enough. The more I reflected on that pattern, the more exhausted I felt. One Sunday afternoon, David mentioned that his family was planning another gathering for the following weekend. Normally, I would have immediately asked what I could bring or how I could help. Instead, I simply nodded and continued reading the book in my hands. David looked surprised. "You do not want details?" he asked. "Not really," I replied. The answer was honest. For the first time, I felt no urgency to prove my involvement. Over the next week, something subtle began to change. I stopped initiating conversations with Margaret. I stopped volunteering for responsibilities nobody appreciated. I stopped rearranging my schedule around the needs of people who rarely considered mine. None of it was dramatic. Nobody could point to a specific argument or confrontation. Yet internally, a major shift was taking place. I was beginning to separate my self-worth from their approval. One evening, Margaret called while David and I were eating dinner. He answered and spent nearly 30 minutes discussing plans for the upcoming family event. After the call ended, he looked at me. "Mom assumed you would handle desserts again." I set down my fork. "Did she ask?" David hesitated. "Not exactly." I smiled politely. "Then the answer is no." The expression on his face revealed genuine confusion. For years, I would have immediately agreed. This time, I felt no guilt whatsoever. Later that night, I realized something important. The pain I had carried since that dinner was beginning to transform into clarity. Margaret's words still hurt, but they no longer controlled me. What hurt more was recognizing how often I had ignored my own feelings to keep everyone else comfortable. A few days later, Rebecca invited me to lunch. As we sat together outside a small cafe beneath clear autumn skies, she immediately noticed the difference in my mood. "You seem lighter," she said. I thought about that for a moment. She was right. Despite everything that had happened, I felt calmer than I had in years. Not because my circumstances had improved. Not because anyone had apologized. The peace came from finally accepting reality instead of fighting it. On the drive home, I passed a neighborhood park where families gathered beneath colorful fall trees. Watching them, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. Belonging cannot be earned through endless sacrifice. Real family does not require constant proof of your value. As I pulled into my driveway, I realized the most painful chapter of this story was no longer Margaret's comment. It was the years I spent believing I needed permission from other people to feel worthy. And, for the first time, I was ready to stop asking for it. The family gathering arrived the following weekend, And for the first time in 15 years, I approached it differently. I did not spend hours planning what to bring. I did not call ahead to ask what needed to be done. I did not rearrange my entire schedule to make everyone else's day easier. Instead, I treated it like any ordinary invitation. I arrived on time with David, carrying a simple store-bought dessert and nothing more. The moment we walked through Margaret's front door, I sensed something unusual. Several relatives looked surprised to see me empty-handed. Normally, I would have already been in the kitchen helping prepare food. This time, I greeted everyone politely and joined a conversation in the living room. For the first half hour, I simply existed as a guest rather than unpaid staff. It was a small change, yet the reaction around me was impossible to miss. Eventually, Margaret approached with a strained smile. "Lauren, I assumed you would be helping in the kitchen." Her tone remained pleasant, but the expectation behind her words was obvious. "Everything seems under control," I replied kindly. "I thought I would spend some time visiting with everyone." For a brief moment, disappointment crossed her face before she forced another smile and walked away. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but it revealed something important. Much of my role within the family had never been about belonging. It had been about usefulness. Later during lunch, I sat beside David and listened to conversations flow around the table. For years, I had worked so hard to gain acceptance that I rarely noticed how one-sided many relationships had become. People expected support from me. They expected effort from me. They expected availability from me. Yet very few people seemed interested in understanding me beyond those contributions. As the afternoon continued, I found myself observing rather than participating. The experience felt strangely liberating. Without constantly trying to earn approval, I could finally see situations clearly. Several relatives barely spoke to me unless they needed something. Others seemed uncertain how to interact with me when I was not actively serving everyone else. By the time David and I drove home that evening, I felt emotionally exhausted but surprisingly peaceful. David noticed the difference. "You seem distant today," he said. I looked out the window at the passing streets illuminated by the setting sun. "No," I answered quietly. "I was just paying attention." He frowned slightly, but said nothing. Over the next several days, that feeling remained with me. For the first time, I was no longer measuring my success by how accepted I felt within his family. Instead, I was measuring something much simpler: whether I respected the way I was being treated. The answer became increasingly difficult to ignore. One evening, as I sat alone on the back patio watching autumn leaves drift across the yard, a thought settled into my mind with unexpected certainty. I had spent years trying to become part of a family that consistently reminded me I was on the outside. Maybe the real question was no longer how to belong. Maybe the real question was how much longer I wanted to remain somewhere I was never truly welcomed. The decision did not happen during an argument. There was no dramatic confrontation and no emotional speech. In fact, the morning I finally walked away looked completely ordinary. The sky was clear. The neighborhood was quiet. David had already left for work, and sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as I drank my coffee. Yet beneath that ordinary morning was a certainty I had never felt before. For weeks, I had been asking myself the same question. How much longer was I willing to stay in a place where my presence was tolerated, but my value was never truly recognized? That morning, I finally had my answer. I spent the next several hours thinking carefully. I was not running away. I was not trying to punish anyone. I simply needed distance from a situation that had slowly eroded my sense of belonging for years. Around noon, I called Rebecca and asked if she still meant what she had said weeks earlier about visiting her lake house for a while. Without hesitation, she told me the guest room was ready whenever I needed it. Hearing those words brought an unexpected wave of relief. Someone wanted me there. No conditions. No expectations. No need to prove myself. That afternoon, I packed a few suitcases. Clothes. Personal items. Books. Nothing dramatic. Nothing permanent. As I moved through the house, I felt surprisingly calm. The fear I expected never arrived. Instead, there was a quiet sense of freedom. Before leaving, I wrote David a short note explaining that I needed time away to think. I told him I was safe. I told him I would contact him soon. Most importantly, I told him that I needed space to understand why I had spent so many years trying to earn acceptance from people who repeatedly made it clear I did not have it. Then I left. The drive to Rebecca's lake house took nearly 3 hours. As miles passed beneath the tires, I felt tension slowly releasing from my shoulders. For the first time in months, nobody expected anything from me. Nobody needed me to fix a problem. Nobody expected me to ignore my feelings to keep peace within the family. When I arrived, the lake reflected the late afternoon sunlight like glass. The quiet beauty of the place immediately calmed me. Rebecca welcomed me warmly and showed me to the guest room overlooking the water. That evening, I sat alone on the porch wrapped in a light blanket while cool autumn air moved across the lake. My phone buzzed several times. Messages from David. Missed calls. Questions asking where I was and when I would be back. I did not respond immediately. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Because for once, I wanted to hear my own thoughts before listening to everyone else's. As darkness settled over the water, I realized something important. For years, I believed walking away meant failure. Now I understood that sometimes walking away is the healthiest choice a person can make. Not because they stop caring, but because they finally start caring about themselves. And somewhere back home, a family that had always assumed I would remain exactly where they left me was about to discover what my absence actually meant. The first few days at Rebecca's lake house were quieter than any period I could remember in years. Mornings began with sunlight reflecting across the water, and evenings ended with the gentle sound of wind moving through the trees. Without the constant pressure of family expectations, I finally had room to think clearly. For so long, my life had revolved around maintaining relationships that often left me feeling invisible. Now, for the first time, I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. Meanwhile, back home, the reaction to my absence was unfolding faster than I expected. David called several times each day. At first, I let the calls go to voicemail. Eventually, I listened to the messages. They were not angry. They were confused. He kept asking the same question in different ways. Why had I left? The answer seemed obvious to me, yet apparently it was not obvious to him. One afternoon, I finally returned his call. We spoke for nearly an hour. David sounded exhausted. He admitted the house felt different without me there. Meals were forgotten. Errands went unfinished. Plans that I normally coordinated suddenly became problems nobody knew how to solve. As he described these inconveniences, I realized something important. He was noticing everything I did. What he still did not fully understand was how I felt. Before ending the call, I asked him a simple question. Have you spoken to your mother about what happened? There was a long silence. Then he admitted he had not. That answer told me more than anything else could have. Back at the lake house, I continued focusing on myself. I spent afternoons walking along quiet trails and reading books I had postponed for years. Rebecca never pressured me to talk, but whenever I needed to, she listened. One evening as we sat watching the sunset over the water, she asked whether I missed home. I thought carefully before answering. I miss what I hoped it would be, I said. The distinction mattered. During the following week, something unexpected began happening within David's family. Relatives started reaching out. An aunt called to check on me. A cousin sent a message asking how I was doing. Several people expressed surprise that I had left. More surprisingly, some admitted they understood why. Apparently, Margaret's comment at dinner had stayed with more people than I realized. Many had remained silent that night, but silence did not always mean agreement. Meanwhile, Margaret herself remained strangely quiet. According to David, she initially assumed I would return after a few days. Then a week passed. Then another. As my absence stretched longer, confidence slowly gave way to concern. The family gatherings continued, but something felt different. The person who usually organized details, remembered birthdays, and held everyone together was no longer there. One evening, David called again. This time his voice sounded different. Less defensive, more thoughtful. He told me he had spent the previous weekend looking through old family photographs. For the first time, he noticed how often I was missing from the pictures because I had been taking them. He noticed how many family traditions depended on my effort. He noticed how much of our life together I had quietly carried without recognition. As I listened, I realized something was finally changing. Not because I had argued. Not because I had demanded respect. Simply because I had stepped away and allowed people to experience what life looked like without me. Nearly a month after I arrived at Rebecca's lake house, I finally agreed to meet David in person. We chose a small coffee shop halfway between the lake and our hometown. The morning was cool and clear, and as I walked toward the entrance, I felt surprisingly calm. Weeks earlier, I would have arrived carrying frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Now I carried something different. Clarity. David was already seated when I arrived. The moment he stood to greet me, I could see the change in him. He looked tired, but he also looked thoughtful in a way I had not seen for a long time. After we ordered coffee, we sat quietly for a moment before either of us spoke. Finally, David took a deep breath. I should have said something that night, he admitted. There was no excuse attached to the statement. No explanation. No attempt to soften it. Just honesty. He told me he had spent the past several weeks reflecting on everything that had happened. The dinner. My departure. The years leading up to both. He admitted that he often stayed silent because keeping peace felt easier than confronting uncomfortable truths. What he failed to understand was that every time he protected peace, he left me standing alone. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of relief. Not because they erased the past. They did not. But because for the first time, he truly understood it. David also told me he had spoken extensively with Margaret. Their conversations were difficult. For perhaps the first time in his life, he challenged assumptions he had accepted without question. According to him, Margaret eventually acknowledged that she had spent years treating me as someone adjacent to the family rather than part of it. She never expected me to leave. She assumed I would continue doing what I had always done, accepting less than I deserved while remaining available whenever needed. In that moment, I realized something important. My absence had accomplished what years of explanations never could. It forced everyone to confront reality. A few days later, I agreed to meet Margaret as well. We sat together on a bench overlooking a public garden. The conversation was quiet and respectful. She apologized. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but sincerely. She admitted that she often viewed family through a narrow lens shaped by habit and tradition. Somewhere along the way, she forgot that belonging is created through love and commitment rather than blood alone. I listened carefully. Then I thanked her for being honest. Forgiveness did not arrive instantly, but bitterness no longer felt necessary. By the beginning of winter, I returned home. Not because anyone convinced me to come back. Not because I needed their approval. I returned because I finally understood my own value without requiring anyone else to define it. The relationships around me were not perfect. They probably never would be. Yet something fundamental had changed. Boundaries existed where none existed before. Respect replaced assumptions. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth through other people's acceptance. Looking back now, I understand that walking away was never about abandoning family. It was about refusing to abandon myself. Sometimes the strongest decision a person can make is not staying and enduring more pain. Sometimes strength means stepping back long enough for everyone, including yourself, to finally see the truth. And once that truth becomes impossible to ignore, everything begins to change.